Ramona looked out of the window. Long scarlet fingers clung onto the late afternoon clouds. In the distance, powerful waves crashed into the tough rock. Within an hour, the land would be dark. She studied the scene for a moment before steadying her trembling lip. After all this time, she could not betray any more emotion in front of the man who had been the centre of her life for the past couple of years. A pause, and then she turned back to face the room, deliberately avoiding eye contact as she walked around the bed in which he lay. He did not seem to notice, or even care. As she reached the door, she focused on the knowledge that the suffering was soon to end. As Ramona's unconscious led her to the kitchen, her feet immediately following the plan that had been laid out for her. She took a moment to listen for any movement coming from the bedroom, and then quietly reached up to the cupboard. With the children not around, she opened it up and brought down a glass of clear liquid. Studying her fingers through it, there was no trace of the solution that had been carefully measured and mixed into it. Deciding that this was the moment, she walked back to the bedroom and placed it on his bedside cabinet. Not 5 minutes later, she watched, with a cruel satisfaction, as he reached forward and placed the straw into his mouth. Not wanting to make the moment any more difficult than it need be, Ramona left in haste. The next morning, the man was pronounced dead. The catch? This man was Ramón Sampedro, the first Spanish citizen on record to have requested assisted suicide to the courts, and it was his decision to drink the lethal dose of potassium cyanide. Yeah, something a bit different. Different way to open up this episode. Hello guys, how you doing? It's James Brewfree here, host of the Hispanophiles podcast, Travel in Spain with Only Half a Brain, the podcast that starts with Magellan but ends with Elcano for the very final episode of the year, the final episode of 2025. Something a little bit different. I took inspiration from the book The New Spaniards by John Hooper, published by Penguin, in which he tells the story of Ramón Sampedro and also discusses the film adaptation, the film representation of his life and of his desire for assisted suicide, El Mar Adentro. I found myself gripped by the story, so I wanted to make an episode dedicated to Ramón Sampedro and the evolution of the laws surrounding euthanasia and assisted suicide in Spain. Like I said, this is not going to be a fun, happy-go-lucky, bouncy episode, a little bit more serious. Because of the nature of the topics we're going to be discussing, there is no way that YouTube or other algorithms are going to push it so far. So straight off the bat, I'd like to say, if you do enjoy the content and find this as interesting as I did, please give it a like, a comment, a follow, all the rest of it. You don't have to, but it would be hugely appreciated. Let's start off with the regular segments, beginning with the Spanish news story of the week. Believe it or not, a few days ago, as I'm recording, there was an earthquake near Vitoria-Gasteiz in the Basque Country in the north of Spain. The Instituto Geográfico Nacional reported a 4.0 magnitude earthquake on Sunday the 7th of December 2025 at 10 past 11 in the evening. The closest town, apparently, was the town Berrosteguieta, a very long and difficult to pronounce Basque name, as most of them are. A place of only 590 inhabitants, and apparently the epicenter of the earthquake was a couple kilometers from there. No reported casualties, no major reported damage, and the European Mediterranean Seismological Centre recorded a 3.7 earthquake in the region at the same time. So not a news story that is particularly graphic in terms of human or animal cost, just an oddity. This is nowhere near a fault line, so the cause remains unknown. We move on to the Spanish vocabulary of the week. Now, the first word that came to mind was something that I learnt as a consequence of conducting the research for this episode, cianuro, which is cyanide, which again shall become relevant very, very shortly. I did learn it while researching this episode, but it's not a particularly happy thing to be discussing, I think. Neither is it a product that I wish you to become particularly familiar with, so instead, I'd like to pose another vocab of the week, something I've also learned very recently, a good slangy Spanish idiom, irse al garete. Basically, it's going to the dogs. So you would say, for example, este país se ha ido al garete. This country has gone to the dogs. Very colloquial, not the type of thing to say in a job interview or in a court, for example. Very slangy, but I quite like it. Irse al garete, to be going to the dogs. And so we move on to the main talking point of the episode. And we'll start with the life of Ramón Sampedro. Born on the 5th of January 1943 in the small town of Puerto del Son in Galicia on the west coast, in La Coruña province, but quite close to the city of Vigo, one of the more industrial, bigger cities nowadays in that part of the country. Ramón Sampedro was a seafarer, a mariner, during his young life, working on repairing boats, and he visited many ports around the world. He was a man relatively well-travelled, given the opportunities to someone in their 20s in 1960s and 70s Spain. But at the age of 25, in his home region, close to Puerto del Son in Galicia, he suffered an accident. He dived headfirst into rough water on the beach near his hometown, landing on a rocky bed that he assumed would be sandy. He survived, but the incident left him quadriplegic. That is to say, he could not move anything, neither could he feel below the neck down. Quadriplegic meaning 4 limbs not moving. He suffered an injury to his vertebra in his spine and was bedbound ever since. For the rest of his life, he could not move a single limb by himself. In 1993, he began his own campaign for the dignity to die. That is to say, to choose to end his own life. And as a consequence, on record, he became the first ever Spanish citizen to request euthanasia. There were 2 ways in which he wanted to achieve this. One was to have his family, the people who were supporting him, deliberately remove the feeding tubes, therefore he could not have any more sustenance, therefore he would effectively die of thirst. Or he asked for a prescription lethal cocktail containing poison that would do the work for him. The Spanish court denied this request on 2 occasions, and then the Constitutional Court rejected his request because there was no legal basis on which to grant his wish. So for almost 30 years, living in his bedroom, reading, listening to the radio, he was a big fan of culture, he enjoyed debates, but being a man who was very active in his youth, felt like he was not living as much of a life as he perhaps could have done, and had come to terms with the fact that medical treatments were not going to help him. Thus, he wanted to end his own life, and the Spanish state had no legal framework to grant that wish. Thus, after attempts on 3 occasions to try and get approval from the Spanish state, he came up with a plan, a clandestine plan he kept to himself. He certainly didn't reveal to his family, but he found a small team that would assist him in the task of ending his own life. The Galician stereotype, it's worth noting, inside Spain, is one of people who are very, very indecisive and won't give you a black or white answer ever. Ramón Sampedro, in this regard, does not live up to this stereotype whatsoever. It's clear his mind was made up. He knew that participation in assisted suicide or euthanasia carried a jail sentence of 2 to 5 years on the basis of what he was planning. But he did not want anybody to suffer as a consequence of him proceeding to undergo his own assisted suicide. So what he did, using a network of connections that he had established in the final years of his life, he moved from Puerto del Son to a small town called Boiro, maybe 25 kilometers away, if I'm not mistaken, on the other side of the headland in La Coruña province. He deliberately distanced himself from his family to protect them from any potential legal implication of what was about to happen. He also was very aware that they had long taken umbrage with his decision to end his own life. They were not in favour of the plan. For this flat in Boiro, he got 11 different keys cut and distributed them to 11 people that formed a part of the chain in which his life would be deliberately taken. Each of these 11 people were given a different task. One person had to purchase the cyanide. The second had to chemically analyze it and ensure its contents were capable of taking somebody's life post-consumption, post-drinking them inside a cocktail. The third person had to measure out the quantity of the cyanide for the task. The fourth person had to take it out of the place where it was prepared. The fifth person had to bring it to the flat in Boiro, where Ramón Sampedro was. The sixth person was tasked with preparing the mixture into which the cyanide would be emptied and then drunk. The seventh person had to pour it into the glass, actually putting the cocktail together. The eighth person had the simple task of putting a straw into the glass. The ninth person was to place the glass containing cyanide mixture within Ramon's reach. The 10th person was to collect a farewell letter. And the 11th person, the final person in the chain, was to videotape the final moments of Ramon's life, in which he gave a speech to camera deliberately, stating what he was doing and why. And then also, in the videotape, he proceeded to lean forward, taking the straw into his mouth and drinking the entire solution. Why did he do it this way? Quite simply because none of those individual 11 tasks in and of itself is a crime. Therefore, he was deliberately making sure that if people were discovered to be part of this, the chain, the elaborate clandestine plan for him to take his own life, there would, in theory, be no immediate legal basis in which they could be arrested and jailed for participation in the assisted suicide. Very clever. But of the 11 people involved, one in particular did have a rough time in the immediate aftermath of what happened. Her name was Ramona Manero Castro, known locally by her friends as Moncha. She was a single mother, I think in her 20s, living in Boiro, close by, working in a fish processing plant. Again, lots of coastline in Galicia, and it is very known for its seafood. She was also a DJ at a local radio station, Radio Boiro, as it's presented in the film, which we'll come to in a second. In the final years of Ramón Sampedro's life, the two became friends. She became aware of his plight and approached him to offer solace, to offer companionship, but also to try and be of some utility and comfort to him in his struggle. Ramona, Moncha, she was the person who held the videotape recording Ramon's last moments. And his last words, this is my translation of what he said. As you can see, next to me I have a glass of water that contains a dose of potassium cyanide. When I drink it, I will have ceased to exist, giving up my most prized possession, my body. I regard living as a right, not an obligation. I have been obliged to bear this painful situation for 28 years, 4 months and a couple of days, and after all this time, I've taken stock of the path I have walked, and the numbers don't add up regarding my happiness. Only time and the evolution of consciousness will one day decide if my request was reasonable or not. With this word, he leapt forward, took the straw into his mouth, and began to drink. This was on the 11th of January 1998. At dusk, Ramona left the flat. The next morning, her sister Lupe took the key, entered the flat to find the body of Ramón Sampedro. He was pronounced dead on the 12th. The autopsy did indeed find the lethal level traces of cyanide inside his body. But the local media, the local police, and also the family of Ramón Sampedro were very much aware of the friendship that had existed between Ramona and Ramón. She was arrested a few days later for having participated in the suicide of Ramón Sampedro. Nevertheless, Ramon's plan had worked. The forensic scientists, exploring the crime scene, taking her DNA, all the rest of it, they did not find a single scrap of evidence to suggest that she had any more involvement in his death. Therefore, she was not tried in court. During this process, the story grabbed media attention, and on Ramona's behalf, thousands of Spaniards who sympathized with Ramon's story took to the media, took to the streets, and they protested on her behalf, claiming that the drink was prepared together. It was Ramona and Ramón and the other people who were not named, who were equally guilty if anybody had to be guilty in this case. 7 years later, after the statute of limitations let this crime expire, and Ramona could not be legally tried by a court of law anymore for her involvement in Ramón Sampedro's death, she then confessed to being the one to supply the lethal poison to Ramón, and having been the one to record his final moments. The Sampedro family always against the decision, accused Ramona of murder once again. A prosecutor on their behalf requested the case be reopened, but again, a spokesman of the judiciary said that after 5 years, such a case cannot be reopened. Therefore, as of the 12th of November 2004, Ramona cannot be sentenced for any involvement she had in the death of Ramón Sampedro, and neither can any of the other 10 participants, whose names, might I add, were difficult to find during this research. I could not find who they were, so that leads me to believe that Ramón was very careful to protect these people as well. Posthumously, when Ramón Sampedro became an author, he published 2 works, the most prominent being Cartas desde el Infierno, Letters from Hell, published by Editorial Planeta, the biggest publishing corporation in the Spanish-speaking world. Cartas desde el Infierno is a collection of his correspondence, his personal correspondence, but also some poetry and his own monologues and thoughts during that Camino, during his campaign from 1993 to 1998 to end his own life willingly. Some of it are letters to people in similar situations. Some of the letters are to religious dignitaries, to people in the courts, to people working in legal professions. And the book collectively is very critical of his relatives, as well as legal and religious entities that opposed his wish. His other book published was Cuando yo caiga, which is the Galician for Cuando yo caiga, When I Fall. Again, a reference not only to his death, but also to the accident, which is the reason why he lived most of his life as a quadriplegic. Published first in Gallego, then in Castellano, and it was Cartas desde el Infierno, and that caught Alejandro Amenabar's attention. Alejandro Amenabar, Spanish mother, Chilean father. At 31, he produced his first full feature-length film. He read Cartas desde el Infierno, and this inspired him to make a film about the life of Ramón Sampedro and his legacy in contemporary Spanish culture. The film, Mar Adentro, translating as The Sea Within. Almost 2 hours exactly in terms of runtime. Release date was the 3rd of September 2004, so just before Ramona could not be convicted anymore of her participation in the act, and also before the case would have been thrown out of court forever, which becomes relevant shortly. The bulk of the filming took place in Girona province in Catalonia, none of it in La Coruña province, unfortunately, but the story is set in coastal La Coruña, written by Alejandro Amenabar and also Mateo Gil, at a budget of about 10 million euros, with worldwide takings of 44 million euros. So, very successful film with an average IMDb user rating of 7.9, and that comes after 88,000 votes. So, a very highly regarded film, a financial success, and also that won an Oscar. Hence the title of this episode. A little bit clickbaity, I know, but nevertheless, it is technically accurate. We'll come to that in a second. The cast. The star, Javier Bardem. I know you know who he is. This is him, very sentimental. He plays the part of Ramón Sampedro. He looks really old in the film, so the makeup did a fantastic job of getting him into the part, and only moving his head and a part of his neck. He was given quite a tall order, portraying so much emotion, so much raw frustration and anger and self-loathing, and he does a very good job. Nevertheless, I think the 3 next stars really do push it to a next level. Belén Rueda, a woman whose name translates into English as Bethlehem Wheel, which, again, there are many different names in Spanish that sound rather odd when translated to English. Dolores, Encarnación, these names, of course, have a Catholic background, but they just sound funny when you translate them to English. Belén Rueda, Bethlehem Wheel is another example. She plays the role of Julia, the lawyer, coming from Barcelona to listen to Ramón Sampedro's cause and try and create a case that could be then presented to the legal system, to the courts, to try and get what he wants. Lola Dueñas, who plays Rosa, which is a stand-in for the character Ramona. We'll come to that in a second. And then Mabel Rivera. She plays the sister-in-law of Ramón Sampedro, the wife of his brother. Those 3, Belén, Lola, and Mabel, I think play fantastic roles. Otherwise, Celso Bugallo plays José Sampedro, which is Ramón's brother. Clara Segura plays René, a confidant and a friend of the family. And then Joan Dalmau plays Joaquin Sampedro, who is Ramon's father. The plot. We start off with opening shots of the room and out the window before we see Ramon. So we effectively see through his eyes to begin with. And there is a clear emotional connection established to the sea and to maritime life. There is a galleon model on display in his bedroom. And then throughout the film, we see Ramon, Jose, and Manuela constantly wearing blue. None of which are very bright, positive shades of blue, if that makes any sense. They're all quite dark and maritime and quite heavy in many regards. Their use of blue constantly in their dress indicates the heavily emotional toll that Sampedro's wish to die has on all of them, and it connects them in the fight effectively. The first scene, we see Julia, which is Belén Rueda, arrive at the Sampedro house. The purpose is to interview Ramon directly, and the families to prepare a case that she can then present in his favour to the courts. And very quickly, the film doesn't really waste time getting to the big question. Within 4 minutes, Julia asks Ramon, "Why do you want to die?" And his answer is, "It's a question of dignity." We see Ramon with very limited movement. We see him exploring his hobbies and pastimes. All those are laid out very quickly. Plus, we see his relationships with his family members that Julia then interviews directly. As we progress through the interviews, the answers given become more nuanced. We start with Jose, Ramón Sampedro's brother, who is completely against the idea, and he's very curt, very direct, very dismissive in the way in which he answers Julia's questions. But then Manuela, his wife and Ramon's sister-in-law, gives the answer, "I want whatever he wants. I just want him to be happy." And she is a lot more evasive. And clearly, therefore, you see in her the emotional turmoil that she's placed in this situation. Also, very quickly in scene 1, we are introduced to Julia's own medical struggles. We see her struggling with her legs, with her own mobility, and that only gets worse as the film progresses. Then, a televised interview of Ramón Sampedro grabs the attention of Rosa, who is a stand-in for Ramon, obviously. She feels compelled to help. She spontaneously visits Ramon one day in the Sampedro home in Puerto del Son and tries to offer a counterpoint only for him to take offence and suggest that her motives for coming were egoistic. She wanted to make herself feel better and that she achieved something. She leaves in tears, but later on the radio, this isn't established if it's the same day, but I think it was a couple of days later in the film, she is DJing in her radio station and she plays a song for him and apologises while he's listening. They make up, she continues to visit, which is much to the bemusement and occasional annoyance of the Sampedro family, who don't fully trust her, know why she's getting herself involved in what is their family turmoil. Julia, the lawyer, returns. She comes to spend more time with the Sampedro family to get more information and to understand to a greater context the reasons why Ramón Sampedro wants to die. Upon her second visit, we see her inquiring more directly into his backstory, into his life prior to the accident, and also the accident as well. Now, Julia, the first character I want to explore here, her involvement as a lawyer trying to create a case for Ramón Sampedro gives us, the audience, the necessary exposition into the backstory of his life and the context for his request to be given permission to die on his own terms. This part of the film is very organic, very well adapted into the script. It doesn't feel like a forced exposition at all. It works really well. Through her, we get a glimpse into him as a young man, a very active man, an ambitious man, and we also see, quite quickly, in his youth, a distinct pleasure in female company. Now, the film does not go out of its way to present Ramón Sampedro as what you might call a player or nothing like that, but we do see his interest in women and also his desire to be sexually active. It's never put particularly explicitly, but you get it quite quickly. As Julia's looking through old photos and documents, she sees one of a particular woman several times. The film doesn't dwell on who she is, but it's clearly someone in the past who meant something to Ramon. Then it comes to the accident, and when Julia's saying, "How did it happen?" Ramon says, "I was distracted." Doesn't go too far into what actually happened, but at this point in the film, we see a reconstruction of him as a young man. The Javier Bardem we are more familiar with, his big, strong, wide shoulders. We see him on the rocks by the beach, and we see a young lady sunbathing close by, And clearly what he's doing, I don't know if this is the actual story of the real life Ramón Sampedro, but this is the direction the film took it in. He jumps off the rocks, off the cliffs, into the water to impress her, and that is when he didn't realise the water was shallow and he breaks his vertebra. Julia, the character, she, in this film, symbolises the wider Spanish society. We see her emotional anguish and tension throughout the film. She's always not sure and struggling with the gravity of what she's been employed to try and work out. With her, we explore the moral and legal implications of what Ramon's trying to do. We clearly see her stepping into Ramon's shoes. The cinematography surrounding Julia works very well. It does an amazing job of showing us that she's trying to empathise with him and get into his head. In one of the scenes, we see her leaning back, reclining in an airline seat, and then the film cuts to Ramón lying back in his bed facing the same way. Also, as her illness increases, as she becomes increasingly less mobile, she literally is put into his position. She collapses in the Sampedro household one day and becomes wheelchair-bound thereafter. Her wardrobe, her colour scheme, compared to the blues and the marine colours that the Sampedro family often wear, we see her with a far more professional, warmer but muted fashion sense. We see more sand colours, yellows, browns, that sort of thing. The lack of blue in her attire demonstrates her position as an outsider in this film, looking into the story. But a lack of bold, strong colours that she's wearing indicate a more pragmatic approach to the question, and a lack of the sort of black and white moralism that we see with the character Rosa. Also, again, going back to Ramón Sampedro's feeling of impotency, literally, we see a confusing exchange of romantic feelings between Julia and Ramón. The Lesson Dormant daydream sequence sees Ramón fantasizing about flying out of the window across the Galician countryside to the beach where he thinks Julia is, and then kissing her on the beach. Using these methods, the film subtly portrays his sexual impotency as a source of indignity. We can see he's also later on romantically interested in Rosa, but also he knows he is not able to sexually engage with a woman in a way that will be gratifying for either party, which again, compared to his prior life in his early 20s, is probably one of the contributing factors, the reason why he sees less reason to continue living in his current state. Then we have the character Rosa. Now, like I said earlier, this film was released before the final expiry date of the case in which it could be reopened, and therefore Ramón Sampedro, the most high-profile accomplice in this case, still could potentially have been implicated on the back of a deliberate verbal reference to her in this film. Thus, the film changed Ramona to Rosa, clearly for legal purposes. Rosa's character, Lola Dueñas, not an actress I was previously familiar with, but I think she does a fantastic job of presenting a humble working-class person struggling with her romantic life, aware there's no glamour in her work, trying to raise kids by herself and trying to keep her spirits up. In the character Rosa, we see an embodiment of the average person's emotional response to the euthanasia question. She expresses far more blunt emotion and asks more simple questions in pretty much every scene she is in. A little bit more tomboyish. She has dungarees and simple ponytails. She doesn't have the level of sophistication to her attire that Julia has. Plus, with Rosa, there are far more bold colours and contrast in her fashion for the majority of the film until the final 20 minutes, which again poses a clear contrast to the blues worn by the Sampedro family pretty much constantly. The character Rosa is, I think, the heart of the argument. Julia, the lawyer, is the brain, the politics, and the intellectual side of the debate, but Rosa is the person who conveys the viscera, the part which doesn't think logically but feels the strongest. The first scene of her in her home when she is trying to get her kids to bed and she has the television on, and she sees the first broadcast of the interview of Ramón Sampedro in his home, kind of talking to the wider world and making his case known. In that scene, we see a bright light in her home. It's well lit and it's warm. It feels far warmer than the rest of the sets we've seen up until that point. And after the first negative encounter, when Ramón Sampedro questions her motives for having come to see him, While Rosa is playing the song on the radio for Ramon, behind his head for the first time, we see a bright yellow light, which indicates him thinking of her in that moment and her metaphysical presence with him in that room. Going back to Julia, before she collapses in the San Pedro home due to her health, she begins to read through Ramon's saved correspondence over the years, and it's her idea to take it all and to publish it into a book, which becomes Cartas desde el Infierno. We see the first draft of the book published before Ramon's death in the film. He gets to look at it and read it and explore and see his own face on the cover. This introduces us subtly to the idea of afterlife as something metaphorical and abstract rather than literal. And again, it introduces us to the idea that we can leave a greater legacy on this planet, and more importantly, with the people we leave behind, through our ideas, through publishing things, through creating artistic work and intellectual work. Contrast that to one character is a quadriplegic church figure, a vicar, a bishop, a priest, I'm not entirely sure. I think a vicar. At one point, the San Pedro family is in the bedroom of Ramon watching television, and this local vicar in a wheelchair gives an interview dismissing Ramón Sampedro's desire for his own death. Effectively, the church figure says, I think he needs more love, he needs more compassion, which upsets the family. Then this church figure visits the San Pedro home to try and speak to Ramon and talk him out of his convictions. And because he's quadriplegic and in a wheelchair, his two young church helpers, some couple 20-year-old boys who are involved in the humdrum tasks of managing a church, they can't carry his wheelchair up the stairwell. And so begins a comical exchange whereby one of these boys runs back and forth between the vicar and Ramon, memorizing the messages each one gives him and then retelling them in front of the other person. And this exchange represents the church's failure to speak to people in this situation and its inability to come up with appropriate answers in the modern era, and therefore a lack of relevancy of the church in the modern context regarding Asia. I think this sequence is a bit on the nose, personally, but I understand what was trying to be hinted at in this particular part of the film. Ramón Sampedro is then taken to the court in La Coruña. An ambulance takes him there, and Ramon enjoys the view on the way. And then we see a strange sequence of things he's focusing on. One of them is new wind turbines, which indicates how things have changed in society since he's been locked up in his home for 28 years. He pauses to look at a couple of dogs copulating in a field, which I thought was an odd choice. Again, it might speak to his unfulfilled sexual desire, I don't know. And then he looks at tractors, farmers going about their life, people driving out of their houses. And I think it's him for the first time feeling like he's maybe part of something bigger and part of the wider world. Also, when he arrives at the court, there are demonstrators, pro-Ramon demonstrators, pro-euthanasia demonstrators outside the court. When he gets inside the courtroom, Rosa's there in one of the back pews. She gives him a wave. The barrister, while presenting his case, asks to read a statement written by Ramon to the judges, and he is denied this, even though he says it'll take only 3 minutes. This speaks to the failure to comply with procedure, which in the real story of Ramón Sampedro was the stated reason why his case was denied 2 times before going to the Constitutional Court. The judge calmly says, you must change the laws if you want to proceed with this, which of course is what later happens. That will be the final thing we discuss in this episode. So they leave the court, Ramon and Rosa are speaking. And Ramon, we really see him overwhelmed here. This is not a particular sad moment, even though the courtroom sequence hasn't gone the way he would like. And he here introduces Rosa to a plan. And at first, she doesn't really know what he's asking. He's just asking for help. In the next sequence, Ramón Sampedro gets back to the Sampedro household, and he receives an upsetting correspondence from Julia in Barcelona, who now effectively cannot come. I think she makes one more visit, but she now is not as mobile. This leads Ramon to have a big breakdown during his sleep. Manuela comes to his aid, and we see the complete frailty and misery and pain that he has endured really come out for the first time in such a way. There are moments when he's snappy or aggressive or quite blunt in his speech, but this is the first time, about 3/4 of the way through the film, we really see Javier Bardem as Ramón Sampedro expressing unadulterated grief in his situation. And so begins the final act, the plan. The day after Ramon has this breakdown, Rosa calls 3 times. Manuela says, this girl wants to speak to you again. Again, Manuela is the sister-in-law of Ramon. When Rosa finally comes to the San Pedro house to speak to Ramon, she is for the first time wearing dark colours and wearing a dark blue sweater. The change of fashion is indicative of the fact that she's now accepted the situation and she knows she cannot convince him otherwise, and she says she is willing to help Ramon with the plan. And the final 20 minutes of the 2-hour film, we see this happen. We see him move from Puerta del Son to Boiro. We see the outrage of José Sampedro, his brother, who explains in incredibly crude language his disgust of having been, the word he uses is a slave. He's been a slave and he feels his family has accommodated his brother in his quadriplegic situation for years and years and years. And now it has come to nothing because he is willing to die, and he is disgusted by this. And the confrontation, very intense. We see the acquisition of the cyanide. Now, it's Julia, the lawyer, the person who's holding a little vial of what look like little, quite large salt crystals. That is the only time in the film in which I see anything that could resemble any kind of chemical product purchased that I guess represents the cyanide. And then we see the final goodbyes. We don't see the faces, which again I quite like as a move, but we see a bunch of people gathered round San Pedro's bed in the new flat in Boiro, raising their glasses, cheersing. I think they're drinking cava or champagne or something. Then we get to the quiet final scene of Ramon speaking to camera, following the original script of the real-life Ramón Sampedro's address to the camera, and then we see him drinking the mixture, and about a minute of Javier Bardem simulating choking and being poisoned, and we can see clear discomfort as he starts to lose consciousness. He coughs, he chokes, and his eyes begin to roll into the back of his head. And the film ends. How was Mar Adentro received by wide society and the industry? Mar Adentro won the prize for the Best Actor at the Venice Film Festival in September 2004. It won an Oscar in January 2005 for the Best Foreign Movie, and Alejandro Amenabar dedicated the win to San Pedro, wherever you are, in his acceptance speech. Javier Bardem. The role here is very different to the films that I think an English-speaking audience will be more familiar with him in. Again, we know him from action roles. We see him as a big, strong, imposing, powerful character. But in this film, only being able to move his head and parts of his neck, very, very different. And he plays a great role, conveying deep emotions while only being able to move one part of his body. He speaks very fast throughout, which I guess is a replication of the real-life San Pedro's way of speaking. There is some accent there, and we do see some lines of film delivered in Galician, in Gallego, particularly when talking to his brother, Jose. For me, I didn't find Javier Bardem the easiest character to understand. Again, me listening not as a native Spanish speaker, and that's one thing that I didn't like as much about it. But again, I am someone who relishes the profusion of high-quality media in different languages because I'm someone who learns languages, and I see value in more people around the world speaking foreign languages. So to have part of the film in Galician, I'm willing to overlook the fact that it meant I couldn't really tune in quite to the same degree. If you're not familiar, Galician is the language spoken in Galicia, and it is more closely related to Portuguese than it is to Castilian, which is the main Spanish language. Portuguese, in fact, developed from Galician. So it is way more closely related to Portuguese than it is to the main Spanish languages. Javier Bardem as Ramón Sampedro, of course, a greater degree of attention was played to him as the lead role in this film. But like I said, the three that I think stand out amazingly are Belém Rueda as Julia the lawyer, Lola Dueñas as Rosa, aka Ramona, and Mabel Rivera as Manuela, Ramon's sister-in-law. The three of them, fantastic. The last two I wasn't familiar with prior to watching the film. Lola Dueñas plays the emotional inconsistency of Rosa's character and the pure but untempered fire inside her. Plays it very, very well. She's a character easy to sympathise with. When she gets jealous, when we see her taking offence to things, we really feel that with her. And then Mabel Rivera, the Manuela, the sister-in-law of Ramón Sampedro, her range in the film is far more limited, but she plays a role of a reluctant but caring surrogate mother to Ramón Sampedro, a person her own age who is self-loathing and doesn't want to be there. She plays it very well with a huge amount of dignity. She is under such an emotional stress to care for someone who she wants to keep alive in spite of what he wants. Fantastic role. Absolutely love it. That is the film, Mar Adentro, The Sea Within. I would highly recommend it, hence me doing an episode about it. Where did I get this idea from? I, last year, was reading The New Spaniards by John Hooper, published by Penguin, and the chapter dedicated to the arts, this story came up in it and it gripped me. John Hooper in the book makes the observation that the Spanish seem to be world leaders in more visual art fields, but not so much in others, and he gives a few examples here. In 21 years, Spain won 5 Oscars, which is the most of any non-native English-speaking country. The first went to José Luis García's Volver a Empezar, the second to Fernando Truella's Belle Époque, the best foreign film in 1993. The third went to Pedro Almodóvar, I know you know who he is, Todo sobre mi madre, the best foreign film in 1999. And then Almodóvar's second Oscar for best foreign film was in 2002 for Hablé con ella. And then, of course, the fifth was Mar Adentro. But in other areas of art, the Spanish don't really have such a high standing on the global stage. Ballet, opera, orchestral music, when it comes to things that are audio-based or movement dance, flamenco notwithstanding, the Spanish don't seem to over-represent themselves on the world stage. But then with incredible success in cinema, we also see, with regards to painting and sculpture, the Spanish are world leaders and always have been. 2 of the greatest artists of the 20th century, and in my opinion, 2 of the greatest artists of all time, Dalí and Picasso. Again, people know those artists, but don't necessarily know that they're Spanish. What does it tell you? And the country has contributed a disproportionate amount of talented actors to Hollywood. Penélope Cruz, Antonio Banderas, Javier Bardem, Belén Rueda, Elsa Patacay, plus the directors Alejandro Amenábar and Pedro Almodóvar throwing into the mix as well. So John Hooper asks the question in The New Spaniards, what makes the Spanish very adept at the visual arts over anything else? And I don't have an answer to this. I think about it, but I've not come to a satisfactory conclusion that kind of makes sense. There is, of course, one other visual art field that the Spanish seem to do very, very well at, and that art field is, of course, pornography. But that is a topic for another episode. I have no idea why the Spanish excel so much in visual arts, but if anybody in comments has an idea, please, I beg you, drop a little note in comments. I will read it and I will explore. So we said that Ramón Sampedro's journey, his battle, his crusade, did have a profound impact on Spanish society. What is the current status of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Spain? Following the huge media impact that Ramón Sampedro's death had in Spain, 2 other high-profile cases of assisted suicide contributed to the revision of law very recently. One, March 2007, the Junta de Andalucía, the Andalusia regional government, granted a 51-year-old woman's request to turn off her respirator and die in peace. And then 2017, José Antonio Arrabal, a 58-year-old man who was suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, he published a video of himself decrying the ineligibility for the terminally ill not to be given the right to take their own life in Spain before taking his own life the same day by administering a deliberate overdose of medication. That was on the 2nd of April 2017. Almost 4 years later, March 18th, 2021, the lower house of Spanish Parliament passed a euthanasia bill, La Ley Orgánica de la Regulación de la Eutanasia, or Ley Orgánica 3 de 2021. The court voted 202 in favour, 141 against, with 2 abstentions. On March 24th, 6 days later, the King signed it to ratify the bill, and on June 25th, 2021, the law came into effect, allowing both euthanasia and assisted suicide in Spain for either Spanish natives or legal residents. Beforehand, there was a maximum 10-year sentence for anybody participating in either. Now, prior to conducting this research, I was not aware that euthanasia and assisted suicide are not the same thing. I thought they were synonyms of each other. Euthanasia is the process whereby you have a medical professional carry out, for example, a lethal injection, and you simply lay there. Assisted suicide differs because it means either medical professionals or other qualified people help in the preparation of the death, but the patient carries out the final act. So, Ramón Sampedro's case, him leaning forward to drink the potassium cyanide solution, is an example of assisted suicide, not euthanasia. There are now 7 European countries where assisted suicide is legal. Benelux, the 3 Benelux countries, Austria, Switzerland, Portugal, and Spain. But euthanasia is not legal in Austria or Switzerland. In the first 12 months after the bill passing, La Ley Orgánica here in Spain, there were 336 requests for people to be killed via either euthanasia or assisted suicide. 180 were carried out, so just over half. And the most prone region of Spain where these requests came from was Catalonia. Now, of course, Catalonia being one of the most populated, it would, of course, have more than, let's say, La Rioja or Cantabria. But interestingly, it is the region with the lowest rates of claimed faith. And I wonder if there's a possible link there. More people in Spain who are religious still hold on to their conviction that, as a consequence of biblical doctrine, they see it as wrong fundamentally. In Catalonia, 137 people, quote-unquote, benefited from euthanasia and or assisted suicide. 77 people were men and 60 were women. So this is something that men have, in this year particular, undertaken more. And these numbers come from Science Direct, which was a fantastic source in the preparation of this episode. But it's not just like you can go down to the local clinic and get that injection like that. There are very clear criteria surrounding the regulation of euthanasia and assisted suicide in Spain. And again, this comes as a consequence of direct criticism of the legalization of this act. What are those criteria? Number 1, you must be a Spanish native or a legal resident of Spain. So, to use a very macabre term, no euthanasia tourism. Another criterion, you must be an adult, you must be consenting, of course. You must be suffering serious or incurable illness or in a chronic or incapacitating condition with intolerable suffering. We'll explore that in a second. And the illness must be without possibility of effective treatment and or relief. In the last 2 points, clearly there is room for subjectivity, but Science Direct defines those terms as such. So the term suffering a serious, chronic, and incapacitating condition refers to those limitations that have a direct impact on the patient's physical autonomy and activities of daily life, preventing them from caring for themselves as well as on their capacity for expression and relationship, and that are associated with constant and intolerable pain and psychological suffering, it being certain, or there existing a high degree of probability, that these limitations will persist over time without any appreciable possibility of cure or improvement. And a serious and incurable disease is that which by its nature gives rise to constant and unbearable physical or psychological suffering without the possibility of obtaining a level of relief that the patient considers tolerable with a prognosis of limited life expectancy in a context of progressive frailty. The concept of cure and improvement must also be judged clearly in the grounds of current medical science. So, in other words, a decision isn't made on the back of, well, in 5 years, we might have a treatment available for what you have. That doesn't pass in the judgment of whether or not somebody can proceed to participate in either euthanasia or assisted suicide in Spain. How do you request the procedure? First and foremost, you must produce a written statement to a qualified medical professional referred to as the attending physician. If you can't write because you have problems holding a pen or typing, a recording can suffice. Both must sign, the attending physician and also the patient. Both must be fully lucid, i.e. sober and mentally healthy when submitting the first request. Emphasis on the word fully here, which means you must demonstrate understanding, reasoning, appreciation and decision-making, as well as consistency throughout the process. A medical history of mental or behavioural disorders is most likely going to prevent further action and block the patient's request for euthanasia or assisted suicide. The attending physician, the medical professional that the patient goes to here, by law must outline alternatives to euthanasia and assisted suicide and provide information about illness treatments and also how this may affect loved ones being left behind. That is a legal obligation as part of the process. Also, there is no legal imperative for the doctor in question that is approached to participate. Any medical professional can withdraw immediately on the grounds of conscientious objection. This does not, of course, affect a patient's ability to approach a doctor thereafter, if that is the case. The doctor, the attending physician, then judges the patient's circumstance and request, and if he or she says yes and approves the request, in a maximum of 15 days, the step must be repeated with another licensed doctor, what is referred to as the consultant physician. Now, the attending physician, number one, and the consultant physician, number two, cannot be from the same team or department or faculty. The consultant physician must be chosen from the medical field of the grief or condition, i.e., if the reason for wishing euthanasia is terminal cancer, then the consultant physician must be an oncologist. The final stage, with 2 signatures after both of those requests, the case is submitted to an evaluation committee which contains legal and medical pros. This committee then gives the final verdict, the final approval. If both written requests are approved and the evaluation committee also give the thumbs up, the patient then must give final written consent. Once that is done, the patient has the right to request euthanasia or assisted suicide in a medical environment of their choice. The full time scale for the procedure is between 45 to 50 days, and the patient, of course, has the right to withdraw. Thankfully, this is part of the law. The patient has the right to withdraw from the procedure at any stage. All in all, the entire process, I think, deliberately safeguards against coercion and objections very, very well. The involvement of 2 separate medical professionals who don't work together, plus the evaluation committee, adds a few layers from the patient and the state. This is important for civilian safety. This also hints at my biggest concern about not just euthanasia, but also the topic of capital punishment. I don't ever want to give power to a state to decide whether or not my life should be taken. That, for me, is out of the question. And of course, if you can imagine, if euthanasia exists, a rogue government could try and put pressure on people it sees as undesirable to have them executed and have that reframed in the media and to people participating as to their benefit. Again, I'm sure the echoes of history, you can hear which part of 20th century history I'm talking about here. That is not so far removed from what we're discussing. So the fact that we have those layers, 2 medical professionals plus an evaluation committee of people who know the rules, know the biology, know the science, taking the decision and not the state, is, for me, a really important safeguard in this topic. Those people who are in a vegetative state and cannot communicate effectively, i.e. people in a coma, that is not grounds for assisted suicide or euthanasia either. The participant needs to be lucid, they need to be informed about what they're doing, and critically, they need to be medically and emotionally sound. This is something the attending physician will also judge and base their decision on during the consultation. The patient is given plenty of time to rethink. Again, 45 to 50 days, a couple of months, is enough time to reverse one of the biggest decisions of your life. And the fact that there is no mandate, no professional mandate for medical professionals to participate if they choose to object, I think is also a very important step in the treatment, in the handling of this matter. All in all, I think lawmakers in Spain have done a good job to handle a morally delicate subject. I'm not someone who admires lawmakers and lawyers that much, but I think it's been handled well. And we've come to the end of it. The final segment, again, as always, we have our Spanish recommendation of the week. This is going out mid-December. We've got New Year's festivities soon. I want you to gobble down 11 grapes as quickly as you can on New Year's Eve to bring prosperity, to bring fortune, to bring luck, and to bring love and balance into your life and those of your loved ones in the following year. Very serious topic today. Hopefully the next one will be a bit more fun. And there's nothing else I can say. Guys, for those of you who have been listening to multiple episodes of this year, thank you very much for being part of my 2025. This project is something that I love doing. It allows me, a young Brit who always dreamed of living in Spain, to get closer to the country that I love. And honestly, this is something I really love. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And go have an amazing year. Thank you very much, guys. Take care. one of the when